Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he can't decide whether he wants to play Helpful Hunter or Spirited Companion. It's Matt Morgan.
So our daughter recently was scared to tell us that she failed a history exam, and I said, don't worry, it's all in the past.
I suppose that's true. Matt, that's very Hakuna Matata of you. Hakuna Matata, even.
Well, it was nice, but I had to remind him, those who fail history are doomed to repeat it.
Well done. All right, up next, he knows the answer for choosing between Helpful Hunter and Spirited Companion is, of course, both. Why not both? It's Dana Roach.
As we head into the holiday season here, for the first time, I've actually just kind of realized that there's only 25 letters in the alphabet around Christmas time because there's no L.
Okay, did not see that coming. I love that. Well, Dana, what is it that we're talking about in this week's episode?
We're talking about the most overrated cards of the year 2024.
Yeah, we're looking at some of the most popular cards of the year and discussing whether they actually deserve those top spots. And maybe later on we'll even get into some cards that were overhyped when they first came out and were expected to make a huge impact, but which actually had some pretty modest results. But before we get into it, we've got some stuff to let y'all know about first.
This show is being brought to you by Cardsphere, our favorite way to turn unplayed Magic cards into played Magic cards. I just put a list together for a new deck, and I tried out a couple of Cyclonic Rifts I wasn't using to pick up about a dozen cards needed for this new deck. And I know Matt and Joey have been using it to build new decks as well. You just send out cards you don't need, and it gets you money in your Cardsphere account to pick up the cards you do need. If you click on the link in the video description, the show notes below, you can check them out. Cardsphere your deck, so people card fear your deck. That one's for free, Cardsphere. You can have that one for free on me.
Well played, Dana. Yeah, check out cardsphere.com for all the reasons Dana just gave us. But if you would like to support the show, there's lots of ways you can do that as well. You can like this video. You can subscribe on YouTube or local podcast apps. There's all those free ways that we definitely appreciate. But there's also patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have all sorts of patron tiers, whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see all these episodes a day before the rest of your friends get to. That's such a huge thing, and you can dunk on them for all the knowledge that we bestow upon you in these episodes. You can do that all at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the weekly coveted patron shout out, which we're going to give this week to Billy Gillette, who is cousins to the Gillette family of the Razor Blade Fortune.
Wow.
Billy, I hope that somebody leaves you some money from those razor blades. It's cutting it a little close, but that's kind of what Gillette does anyways.
Goodness. Well, thank you so much, Billy. Thank you to all of our patrons. It means the world to us. Y'all make this show happen. Okay, guys, let's get into our topic here. We're talking about some overrated cards from this year. Matt, where ought we start?
I mean, I think if we're going to talk about overrated cards, let's start from the top. What is one of the most played cards from this year even? Because I know, Joey, this is in your notes. So why don't we just start from the top? 3 Tree City. Folks, apparently not everybody thinks this card is great. I think it is. So for those of you who didn't check out Bloomborough very much, 3 Tree City is a legendary land that enters, and you choose a creature type, and you can tap it to add a colorless, or pay 2 and tap it, choose a color, add an amount of mana of that color equal to the number of creatures you control of the chosen type. If you're playing any sort of token deck, this is just fantastic. Joey, what are you on that you think 3 Tree City is overrated?
Yeah, this is one of the most popular cards of the year. It's showing up in 87,000 decks, 6% of decks that are eligible to play it. That is a huge rate for such a new card. Mm-hmm. And I do like this card, but I don't $23 like this card. And for it being the most popular card of the year, that to me is a little bit of a surprise. I think that, when we see cards like this, we compare it to Gaia's Cradle or to Nykthos. And for me, I do like some of those other options a little bit better. And you actually said something when talking about 3 Tree City that I really agree with. You said that this is great in token decks. And that is, I think, actually its best application. But I think one of the reasons I would be tempted to call this card overrated is because it makes its way into a lot of decks that care about a single creature type, elves and zombies and stuff like that. And when it's just being used in one of those creature decks and you need at least 4 of those creatures for it to start producing a mana benefit beyond just a regular land, that to me is a pretty tall order compared to some other comparable effects, and that's why I find it to be a little bit not worth the money and not something that I've felt like I had to go pursue for any of my decks.
Yeah, I'm with Joey in the fact that it's a fine card, but the amount of decks where it's good is smaller than the amount of decks that it's currently showing up in right now. I would dare say Nykthos produces the amount of mana you think Three Tree City is going to produce in 10 to 20 times as many decks. Like, I've got Nykthos in quite a few decks, and the amount of times Nykthos isn't making me bonus mana is pretty narrow. The amount of times this is making you bonus mana is pretty narrow, that it's productive versus Nykthos not being. In the right deck, it's a very good card. The amount of right decks is smaller than the amount of decks it's being played in currently.
See, I'm going to push back so hard. So not even if you discount the 164,000 token decks out there, there's all sorts of different decks out there that do care about that just kind of do it incidentally. Like, you look at aristocrats decks, those are chock full of clerics a lot of times, or you're making a bunch of tokens that are going to have some sort of a type, whether it's zombies, anything like that. Spellslinger decks, they're always making, say you have a young pyromancer, it's making a bunch of elementals. I've actually found it's not that hard at all to make a good amount of tokens incidentally. Even in landfall decks, you look at my Omnath Locus of Rage deck, I routinely will have 5+ elementals on the battlefield, or even, you're looking at Rampaging Balos and all the tokens those make. It's actually pretty easy in a lot of decks to fit this in outside of dedicated token decks. Now, you say that you don't think that it's worth the money. Well, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which is the devotion version of Three Tree City, is $35, and it's still in almost 275,000 decks.
But I would say Nykthos earns that money way more frequently than Three Tree City does.
I think Three Tree City is earning every penny that it is right now.
Matt, I love the things you've described of what this card can do, and I like its applications there. For me, Three Tree City, I think it's misevaluated. Like, it's showing up in dragons decks and angel decks and things like that, which are creature type decks that aren't necessarily very good at making a whole lot of tokens.
Sure.
I love the descriptions you gave for it. I think it's at its best in a deck that makes a lot of tokens. If you're playing Edgar Markov or Chatterfang, those are decks that care about a specific creature type that will make so many tokens that you're going to really get the benefit off of that. But in a deck like Jitte, which has a whole bunch of angels, a Nykthos, even 2 angels could get you 6 mana pips for a Nykthos, but that doesn't do anything for Three Tree City. So for me, that's why I feel like this card gets misevaluated, and that's why I would call it a little bit overrated. I think it winds up getting put into some of the wrong places, and I'd much prefer to see it in the places that you described, because the tokens are so good for it in a way that maybe just the creature type part kind of distracts some people. So that's why I had it in my notes for this episode.
Okay, I'm ready for the comments to tell you that both of you are wrong. That's fine. We've been wrong on the show before.
I'm trying to agree with you, Matt.
Either way, yeah, I can see arguments, but I still think that it is the number one played card of the year. I personally struggle to call it overrated because I think it's very properly rated when you look at the context of the rest of the cards that were printed this year.
All right, yeah. I wouldn't call it my card of the year, I suppose, but it's certainly extremely popular, and that's why we're talking about it. But that is also why we got to move on to something else that's very, very popular. And Matt, this is one that showed up in yours and in my notes for this episode, and that's the card Fell the Profane. And maybe this is an excuse for us to talk about a couple of MDFC lands out there, but Fell the Profane is one of the most popular ones out there. That is the 4-mana black sorcery that black instant that lets you destroy target creature or planeswalker, and it can be a land on the other half that can enter tapped, or you can pay 3 life for it to enter untapped. Where are we at with this one?
I actually think I like Fell the Profane a little more than either of you two do. I think the problem with Fell the Profane is the same problem as a bunch of MDFCs have, where I think realistically a deck can only support a couple of these cards before you start having problems with your mana base. And I think we're at that maximum saturation point right now where like there's so many of these that are worth at least considering that something has to come out. And maybe this makes the cut. It's made the cut in a couple of my decks and it's performed okay. But we're at the point where whenever they add new MDFCs to the card pool, something has to give. And this isn't one of the ones that feels like it's going to automatically reserve a slot. So while I think it's decent, it suffers from the fact that there's just only so many different ones of these cards you can run. And I think we're at the point where you can't continue to add more. Something comes out, and this one probably comes out.
See, I don't even think that this is good as face card either. I talked a while back about how I don't really like Hagra Mauling. It's almost always going to be 4 mana, and I don't think that's a very good rate for a MDFC that's going to let you cast a destroy target creature when we're already getting away from Hero's Downfall as a card that has more flexibility and it costs less mana. I don't, even for the flexibility, I don't love Fel the Profane. I don't think that it's warranted to be the third most played card of the year.
Yeah, and the number 2 card from Modern Horizons 3 is showing up in 8% of decks that are eligible to play it. I mean, that's a huge rate. It's showing up in 81,000 decks, almost 82,000 probably by the time this episode comes out. It's got a great amount of play to it. But for me, I'm also a little bit not unimpressed. I think like it sounds like a nice thing to have. But Dana, as you were saying, there is that saturation point. A lot of the other MDSCs that we have available to us out there, like Malakir Rebirth or Balaged Recovery, or even the blue one Sink into Stupor, I feel like some of those effects that they provide are more niche, more interesting, more unique, and therefore in the moments where they're good, they're excellent. Whereas Fel the Profane, as a backup, I can destroy something. It's twice the cost of other spells in this color that would do that. You know, you've got Infernal Grasp, you've got Go for the Throat. This is literally double that cost for flexibility that feels a little bit forced. And for me, if I'm paying 4 mana to destroy something in black, I'd rather that it be on like a Ravenous Chupacabra, which I can then blink or sacrifice or bring back from the graveyard the way that I love to do in my black decks. And that's kind of another knock against it for me. So I don't dislike the card, but it being the number 2 card from Modern Horizons 3 is a little bit woe to me.
The cost doesn't bother me because it's not a spell. It's a land. At least this is how I look at MDFCs. It's a land that comes into play tap, so I've got a small tempo hit that on turn 9, when I've drawn enough cards that I don't need to play it as a land, I can afford to use it as a removal. It's a luxury removal spell I can afford to use because I didn't need to keep it in my hand as a dead card because I've drawn, at this point enough cards that I have more lands that I need. So the cost doesn't really feel bad for me necessarily. It's just I feel like I can only afford so many lands that come into play tapped or ding me for 3 life when they come into play before that also causes problems with my deck. And the opportunity cost, while I don't mind paying it, I just don't want to do it for more than a couple cards. And we're at that point, like I said.
Yeah, we're definitely at the point. And like I said, I know the immediate analogy that I go to is Hagra Mauling. That's only showing up in 51,000 decks, whereas over 81,000 decks for Fel the Profane. I don't think that there's that much of a difference between those 2 cards either. So I really struggle with Fel the Profane specifically. Sink into Stupor, absolutely fantastic. It's such a good tempo hit. Even Witch Enchanter, I really, really like as 1 more mana to get either the land or a Reclamation Sage. And that type of effect is totally fine in my mind too. But where Hagra Mauling, like Joe, you listed off 5 kill spells that you're going to play over this. You don't need a 6th one when it's this bad.
And those were just ones that I was trying to name in black. If you're playing blue, then you've got a lot of other reality shift, Pongifies. If you're playing white, you've got all the classics there. As soon as you add on extra colors, I feel like this card gets devalued a little bit more and more for me. And not only that, but I've seen a lot of other MDFCs that have really impressed me. Like when I see Sundering Eruption, one of the red ones, for instance, that forces creatures to not be able to block very well. Like that, I've seen that card win games. Like some of the other MDFCs I've been a lot more impressed by this year. So that's why I kind of put Fel the Profane here as like, I wouldn't call this as like one of my favorite cards from Modern Horizons 3 at all.
The next card on our list here is from Bloomburrow, and actually I think I also like this one a little more than you guys do. Dawn's Truce. It's a instant spell. You and permanents you control gain hexproof till end of turn, and if the gift was promised, and you can gift a card to someone, permanents you control also get indestructible till end of turn. So basically, it's if you gift something, it's a heroic intervention, but also gives you hexproof. I actually quite like this card. I do think this space is also getting a little bit crowded and you only want so many of these effects. And we just recently had Galadriel's Dismissal, which is a really, really good card as well. Clever Concealment is pretty fantastic. White has a lot more of these like blanket protection effects than green does. That's one of the reasons Heroic Intervention shines so much in green, is it's kind of the best of the class, whereas there's a lot more competition here. But I do think this one like has a lot of room to shine in decks. I'm curious why the two of you don't love it as much. Joey, why do you not like it? Why do you think it's overrated?
You named a handful of options there.
Sure.
There's also Teferi's Protection. There's also Akroma's Will. There's also the Selfless Spirit type of effects. I think this is such a dense space already for white decks in particular to be able to protect themselves. And there are cheaper versions of this effect. Not cheaper mana cost, but like budget versions of this effect.
Sure.
And so for this one to be kind of an awkward $6 to $7 when a lot of the other ones feel a lot more impactful to me, me, or a lot cheaper to acquire, a little bit more budget friendly. This one simply hasn't impressed me in the ways that I've seen the others be total blowouts. So for it to be the number 3 card from Bloomborough, it's showing up in 8% of decks that are eligible to play it. Again, that is a huge rate of adoption. About 60,000 decks are playing this one. That's big. And I don't dislike the card, but I just like all the other options so much more.
Yeah. First off, Dana, I'm surprised you like it because it has the option to give an opponent a card. A lot of times I don't think that's very much a trade-off that I'm going to be taking. I think I would like the card a little bit more if it was reversed on the effects that it gives you. So you and permanents you control get indestructible till end of turn, and if you gift the card, then they get hexproof. I think I would like that a little bit more because you're typically giving all of your board, you're giving it indestructible to save it from a board wipe. That's when these types of cards come in play. 2 mana for a give things hexproof. Basically, you're trading removal spell for protection spell at that point. And so I would rather have things get indestructible in mass. But also, Joey, you hit a really good point. This card's $7. Yeah. And I can just think of so many budget options that maybe they cost 1 more mana and you don't have to give opponents a card. I think that's worth it. And when I typically build decks too. So Dawn's Truce, I really don't like this card. I think it's a powerhouse in standard for those types of decks that want it, which aren't even that many.
For me, it comes down to the fact that, like, I think a lot of these spells are good in different situations. I like Clever Concealment a lot, but like I have some decks where I'm not going to have bodies to reduce that cost on it. Gladiator's Dismissal is a great card, but like I have some decks where I'm not going to want to have the mana available for the kicker cost. I feel like in certain decks, being able to solve my problem for 2 mana every single time and not have to worry about having bodies available to tap for it, or not worried about having to have 4 mana free for the kicker cost. Just giving somebody a card to solve this problem, and then presumably I'm going to win before it's relevant. If I'm like keeping this board wipe from taking out my board, I'm presumably going to kill that person before that card they drew really is relevant. So while I don't think it's nearly as ubiquitous as maybe Teferi's Protection is in white, I have plenty of decks where like this is a better choice, at least it feels like it is, than Clever Concealment or Gladiator's Dismissal, depending on how the deck is made up.
I just think, it's the same reason I don't love Fel the Profane. We have so many different options in the slot. I struggled to love this one.
We didn't even mention Flare Fortitude, another option that fits this bill, and which is like half the cost, money-wise. So, like, yeah,
you have a million options. Yeah.
So many options, yeah. So I get you. But, Dana, you're not wrong. And, like, this card isn't popular for no reason. Sure. Not at all. It's a very interesting card. But for me, it's not one that I felt like I had to rush and go get, because I already had so many things fulfilling this card slot, like Matt was saying.
Well, I've got the next card up that we're going to talk about that I think is a little overrated, and a lot of our 60 card players out there are going to tell me I'm very wrong, which is totally fine for different formats. But Springheart Nantuko is a card I want to talk about as being a little overrated in Commander. It's 1 and a green for a 1/1 insect creature monk. It's an enchantment that has bestow of 1 and a green. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1. But the important part here is it has a landfall ability of whenever a land enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a green if Springheart Nantuko is attached to a creature you control. If you do, you create a copy of that creature. Otherwise, you create a 1/1 insect creature token. I know that this was part of the Nadu menace that kind of ruined Modern for a little bit, ruined a Pro Tour. But all the success that this card is seen in Eternal formats, in non-rotating formats, there are so many better landfall options that you can be playing here. I don't see it translating, even if you are making copies, because it's expensive, plus requires a landfall to get that. I think I'm missing something here for being one of the most played cards of the year.
So we've kind of voiced this in a general sense, but we haven't specifically voiced it over the course of the show. There's a difference between a card being good and a card being good enough. Like there's 600 players in the NBA, 25 of them make the All-Star game. Like there's that doesn't mean those other, 575 players aren't amazing basketball players. It just means they're not good enough to make the roster of the All-Star game. This is a good example of a card, and a lot of the ones we've talked about have been that as well. They're really good cards. But you have access to, 30,000 Magic cards for your 100-card Commander deck, and it comes down to whether or not a card is good enough for that deck, not whether it's good. And this is a good example of a card that's really, really good. I just don't think it's good enough for a whole lot of Magic decks.
Interesting. I actually don't have a strong opinion about this one either way, mostly just because I haven't seen it enough in-game to really get much evaluation. Even just as a 2-mana 1/1, it has multiple types, which, like, I enjoy decks that can care about multiple types.
Sure.
But even if you're not doing the bestow thing and not making copies, just playing a landfall and getting an insect token for a 2-mana creature seems kind of nice to me. That seems like a pretty okay rate. I do understand it's competing against the likes of, Scoot Swarm and other more impactful tokens, I suppose.
Right.
But for 2-mana, I don't find myself like frustrated or flustered by this one. I'm kind of like, oh, that seems nice. And I can see other ways in which this card could become a little bit more of a menace in a later game situation. But it doesn't sound like you've had great experiences playing with it in your landfall decks, Matt.
I just think there's so many better things that you can be doing, especially in landfall decks where the strategy is all about accumulating as many resources as possible, getting as many lands on the battlefield. Top decking this after turn 5 is going to feel really bad. And so I'm just not really sure that there's going to be a lot of decks when you could be playing bigger threats that are going to have more of an impact than a Springheart Nantuko, even if you're able to spend all the mana to bestow it, make copies of whatever you're trying to bestow on. By then, you could have just played in another even bigger threat.
Yeah, and I have ran against this a couple times because I have a friend of mine who has an insect deck. I think Grist is the commander, the Planeswalker Grist. And in a deck where you're trying to go wide making insects, there's not a lot of cards that make insect tokens that are good. And this is a good card in that deck. He's always happy to see it, and it always does work. In that really, really specific deck.
Yeah, there's not 44,000
Right,
Grist
exactly,
decks out there,
exactly.
which that's how many decks are playing Springheart Nantuko, which is over a lot of other cards that I see. And I'm like, that is wildly powerful. Holy cow. It's in more decks than Innkeeper's Talent right now, which is blowing my mind.
Yeah, again, this isn't one that I have a super strong opinion on, but it sounds like what you guys are saying is that in the context of landfall decks, that's the one where this is not making quite the impact that you've seen a lot of other landfall payoffs already be able to do. It's sort of a situation of like, we've gotten another really good card for +1 counters decks, or a really good card for aristocrats decks. Does this go in aristocrats? That old classic joke? Like, yeah, it probably does, but that's such a crowded field that you have to be very, very exceptional to really make that cut. Dana, your NBA analogy that you were making there. And so I can see why this one doesn't impress you quite as much as some of the other pre-existing options already do in one of the most crowded fields of deck archetypes that we've got. So, I'm personally, I'm just interested to actually finally see it in play one of these days.
Since we're talking Modern Horizons 3 cards, Flare of Denial, I think, is one that's a little bit overhyped. Came in a little bit overrated. That's the blue counter spell. And, they've tried to make blue counter spells for free in the past and with various restrictions that should make them safe, and that's never ever worked. This one actually, it might have kind of worked. I say it's overrated, but like, it's actually a relatively fair Magic card. But I think people are still thinking it's a broken Magic card. Double blue and a colorless, but you may sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost. So there is a way to cast it for free. But that's a relatively steep cost, particularly the non-token part. The amount of decks that have a blue creature that they are willing to lose to stop anything short of a game-ending spell is, I think, lower than most people think. And it's one of the more popular cards from Modern Horizons 3 and closing in on 30,000 decks right now. I initially, saw it. I'm like, okay, what decks of mine want this? And it's one deck. There was one of my decks I thought that, like, I was going to be able to use this for anything. There are situations where you're like, well, if I don't counter this spell in that maybe like a CEDH environment, the game's over, I'm losing. I tend to not play in that kind of environment. So I have to think, how often is it worthwhile losing a creature that was good enough to make my deck? That's a non-token creature. And the answer was like, not very often.
Yeah, Dana, I'm with you that the loops that you have to jump through are just specific enough, and there's just enough of them existing on the card that it makes it kind of a pain. It has to be a non-token, has to be blue, has to be a creature that you're sacrificing. So it can't be a blue permanent, so you're making any like copies of tokens, whatever. So I definitely consider this for my Coma deck that I built, where I have a million tentacles out there, just sitting out there waiting to be sacrificed, but I can't put Flare of Denial in that
Right.
deck, where otherwise it would be super fantastic. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different hoops that I don't really love. Seeing it show up in this many decks is kind of wild, because I also thought, yeah, it's not really broken, and people really want it to be
Right.
one of those free counter spells that people so much love playing in those high power level tables, and I just don't think this is it.
I think in those extremely high power, Dana, as you were saying, where if you don't counterspell, the game's over anyway, so you might as well. Any free counterspell will probably do. But as you said also, we don't tend to play necessarily in that realm, in which case this is a steeper cost than most of the other free counterspells that we see out there, the Force of Wills, the Fierce Guardianships of the world. In Fierce Guardianship, this is not. But when we as players see potential free counterspell, the thing that we immediately relate it to is going to be the Fierce Guardianship type of thing.
Yeah.
So that's where there is kind of this overhyped upon initially seeing it, but where it actually lands is, a little bit more of a modest fare, perhaps. Personally, my favorite application for this spell is in like a Yuriko the Tiger Shadow deck, because Yuriko likes to be sacrificed. Yuriko wants to go back to the command zone so that one of your unblockable creatures can Commander Ninjutsu her out, stuff like that. Like these flare cards that have that potential sacrifice thing, I like seeing the ways that those can be applied. But I agree with you that this is a very fair card, and honestly, I really like this card. But I definitely do see that moment of, people thought that it was going to be, the second coming of a Fierce Guardianship, and that is certainly not how it actually works out, which, thank goodness, that is what I want from free counterspells. I don't want more free counterspells, but if we're going to get them, I'd like them to look like this.
Yeah, it's a really well-designed card. Honestly, I actually quite like the design and everything about it. It's just probably not as good as people think it is, given the amount of decks it's showing up in.
Yeah, of all the free counterspells that we've gotten, this is probably the weakest one, I would say, just because the hoops are so plentiful and they're so specific. Like Force of Negation, this is very much not.
Yeah, exactly.
But I will gladly sacrifice a flying Mentuit in Edric's Master of Trest for sure, and not feel bad about that.
Fair.
But that's the one of those weird exceptions.
Indeed. All right, guys, we've covered quite a lot so far, but we've got to take a quick break for Challenge the Stats, because there's plenty of other data here on EDHREC that we don't always agree with. So let's challenge the stats before we get back to some other overrated cards.
My first challenge here is for a card that showed up in the Doctor Who set, Ensnared by the Mara. It's 2 and double red for a sorcery. Each opponent faces a villainous choice. They exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. Then you may cast that card without paying its mana cost, or that player exiles the top 4 cards of their library, and Ensnared by the Mara deals damage equal to the total mana value of the exiled cards to that player. I missed this somehow when the Doctor Who set came out, and every time I've seen it cast against me, the amount of value it's generated for 4 mana is absurd. Whatever choice you make is wrong, but and it's going to generate the worst possible outcome. Whether I've picked, the ability for the person to get the spell, they get way more than 4 mana just from me alone for a spell almost every time. And when I pick the damage, I wind up, taking 16 to the face or something ridiculous. And again, that's just me. Like, I feel like just hitting myself, it almost always generates way more value than the 4 mana you spent on it. And then there's 2 more people that are also doing the same thing. It's currently in about 16,000 decks, but almost half of those are the pre-con it came in. People just aren't running this. They missed it probably for the same reason I did. Just as a red card advantage or resource advantage spell, it's really, really good, and I think people should give it another look.
Especially if you're playing a deck that cares about casting stuff from exile and giving you rewards off of those, or you're playing a deck that doubles up your damage effects, then it becomes a really tough choice too. Dana, I'm totally with you. This is one of my favorite Doctor Who cards as well, and if I played more red, you can guarantee I'd play it in more decks. All right, I'll move to my challenge to stats now. I want to talk about Amanatu the Veil Piercer, one of the precon commanders from Duskborn, the Esper Human Wizard, a 2/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, you'll surveil 2, and each enchantment card in your hand has Miracle. The Miracle cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 4. AKA, you'll be able to filter the top of your deck with that surveil, but also whenever you draw a Miracle for the first card each turn, whenever you draw an enchantment for the first card each turn, you can Miracle it by reducing its cost by 4. You can just slam it right into play. A very, very cool way to cheat some costs on very expensive enchantments that otherwise might cost a little bit too much for you to really consider. Amanatu loves those really big enchantments. Obviously, she also loves filtering the top of her deck a little bit, which is why her precon came with some certain cards like Telling Time and Otherworldly Gaze. Telling Time is a 2-mana instant. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, one on the bottom of your library, and another on the top of your library. Ideally sounds like a pretty nice way to set up the top of your deck to get an enchantment there for her to miracle. Otherworldly Gaze is 1 mana to surveil 3. Look at the top 3 cards of your deck, put any into your graveyard, any back on top, and it's got flashback for 2 mana. Those are showing up in 44% and 34% of Amanatu decks respectively, and I think they're fine, but I don't think they're better than cards like Brain Surge, which are only showing up in about a fifth of Amanatu decks. Brain Surge is a 3-mana instant, draw 4 cards and put 2 back on top, and then Amanatu herself can surveil them for you. I think Telling Time and Otherworldly Gaze are cute cards. They're kind of nice cards, but they're not the card advantage options that you actually can get when filtering the top of your deck. So if you're playing Amanatu out there, I think there's a little bit of a precon effect going on with these two. You have other ways of filtering the top of your deck while also accruing more cards into your hand that I would pursue instead of these options. So consider those a little bit more strongly next time you're tinkering with Amanatu the Veil Piercer.
Well, I'll wrap us up this week then. So we got an email recently from Robert Wilbrandt, which you can do. Send us an email at edhrecast@gmail.com. And Robert said, hey, EDHRECast crew, my challenge this week involves an obscure common from Nemesis that is atrocious in every deck except one. Dana, I know you're interested because a common from Nemesis. So out of over 4,000 Helga Skittish Seer decks, only 16 of them and run the card Sky Shroud Cutter. I was looking for ways to trigger Helga without actually paying 4 mana, and Sky Shroud Cutter fits the bill perfectly. So everybody out there, 3 and a green for a 2/2 beast that says if you control a forest, you may have each other player gain 5 life instead of paying Sky Shroud Cutter's mana cost. Dana, I'm sure you played this back in the day. I actually have seen this show up in a legacy deck that was all about False Cure, which was letting your opponent gain life, but actually they're going to lose life because of deck cards out there where Sky Shroud Cutter was an absolute house. So, Robert, I appreciate where your head's at. And you are right. There's all sorts of different ways that you can play around with Sky Shroud Cutter in these decks. And so Helga loves casting spells, casting creatures that are 4 mana or more, and this fits the bill right there. You're able to do it for free. It is each opponent that gains the 5 life instead of in 1v1 formats where it's just one opponent gaining 5 life. There's all sorts of different scenarios where I could see Sky Shroud Cutter showing up. And Robert, you're right. In Helga decks, this absolutely would be super good. Make sure that you're, playing around the 5 life per opponent. But this is a super, super good and easy way to cast spells for free. There's all sorts of different spells from Nemesis that fit the bill here. And so, yeah, if you can find a home for Sky Shroud Cutter, Dane and I both would love to see folks out there finding a home for it.
All right, guys, getting back into our main topic here. In the first half of the show, we talked about some cards that are currently very, very popular, but that we feel maybe are a little overrated in certain places. But now for the second half of the show, I think we're going to talk about some cards that got a lot of hype early in the year, but didn't necessarily pan out all the way. And I want to start us off with one card, and that's Final Word Phantom. I think at the start of the year when this card came out in Murders at Karlov Manor, this received a lot of attention. It's the 3-mana 1/4 Spirit Detective with Flash and Flying, and during each opponent's end step, you may cast spells as though they had Flash. People were hyped for this one. Potentially a Vidalcan Orrery effect that has Flash itself. This was receiving a whole lot of attention, and it's currently showing up in about 7,500 decks or so. It's an okay card. I do not think it lived up to the hype.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are always trying to look for the next coming of insert very, very powerful effect here with Vidalcan Orrery, with Final Word Phantom too. And High Fate Trickster is a card that just came out in Foundations that I know a lot of people have come out very, very high on. It's saying it's going to be finally the new version of Vidalcan Orrery. Yeah, I can see why people really, really wanted to latch on to the next Vidalcan Orrery card.
It's a situation where being able to flash your stuff in is very, very useful, but you need to know why it's very, very useful. You have to have a plan to justify a slot in your deck for the most part. I think, especially on a fragile creature body, you need to have a reason for why you are going to put that in your deck and what you're going to do with it. If you're playing a deck. I have a Vidalcan Ori in a Death Touch deck. Well, the ability to flash in a creature at any point in time when someone's attacking me and block with a creature that's going to kill it is really, really useful. I used to run it a lot in my Glyphs of the Trader deck. I run it as well because there, when something dies, I can bring things back, and like the ability to flash an artifact in that may have a sacrifice effect in response to something that's going to be dying lets me use it and immediately like recur it back to my hand. Like there's reasons to run it in a specific deck. I don't know if it's a good enough effect to just run without a plan. And I think that's where cards like this, I think people are like, oh, being able to flash stuff in is really, really useful. Well, it is. Is it useful enough becomes the question. And I would dare say, in a generic sense, probably not.
And what you just described there was like doing stuff mid-combat, which is one of the big aspects that makes Flash very useful.
Absolutely.
And Final Word Phantom is end step only, and it turns out that's a much bigger restriction than it initially seemed like.
Absolutely.
So this card got a lot of hype, and it turns out it's really only okay. And thankfully, we have other options that we can look at instead.
I think that there's a lot of situations, Dana, like you brought up, where, you're going to flash in blockers. The functional difference for, I would say, a majority of players and a majority of decks out there. So I think that, people are looking for an excuse to just do things on end steps. And that's not the best use of this effect where everything gets flash.
Generally speaking, one sure way to have a card be a little bit overhyped is have it look like a card that's broken in the format to the point where it's banned. Chthonian Nightmare looks a lot like Recurring Nightmare. And that's going to set off the hype circle. 1 in a black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 energy, and then you can pay X energy, sacrifice a creature, and return Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand, and return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can activate only as a sorcery. This does look a lot like Recurring Nightmare. It is not, in fact, Recurring Nightmare. And I think that was the kind of thing that people realized once they put it in their decks and started actually playing with it. But initially, the assumption was it was going to do what Recurring Nightmare does, and it really does not when you put it in a commander deck.
Yeah, I don't think you need Joey or even me. I love Recurring Nightmare. We both would be clamoring if this was a pretty good impression of Recurring Nightmare, which is very obviously banned. It is incredibly powerful card. I know for the best health of the format, Recurring Nightmare should never be unbanned. And I like the swing that they took with Chthonian Nightmare. Yeah. But this having to pay energy equal to the mana value absolutely misses what makes Recurring Nightmare so stinking powerful.
Yeah, my favorite thing to do with reanimation is get back the 8 drops. And this one takes a little bit to build up to that. This one is a more modest affair. It feels like it belongs on a lot of those decks that specifically care about the sacrifice. You know, your Corvolds, for instance, care a lot about the fact that you are sacrificing things. And you can get back some really interesting stuff with it. I don't dislike the card, but Dana, as you said, the comparison when this card first came out was immediately to Recurring Nightmare. And it's a decent imitation of it, but certainly not living up to the types of things that make Recurring Nightmare ban-worthy.
There's some flare of denial stuff going on here where like it's actually a pretty well designed card that's actually quite fair and is, has a place in some decks. But the assumption going in based on the past versions were that it was going to be busted, and it is in fact not busted.
Yeah, which is good. We prefer that.
Absolutely.
Wizards, thank you for not busting.
For sure.
Yeah, it's probably pretty busted if you're playing it in a dedicated energy deck or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the top commanders that are playing energy themes, you're mostly going to be in Jeskai colors. You have to go to Atraxa Praetor's Voice or Yarok the Desecrated.
Right.
So this has potential to be a Recurring Nightmare type of card, but you're out of colors. Black doesn't do a lot of energy synergies because it's been so heavily Jeskai. So it could have been there, but thankfully it's out of the color pie for all the good energy shenanigans. So you're kind of limited to how much you can be playing this, how powerful it's going to be, etc.
I really like the idea of it in a Yarok deck, actually. But yeah, if you have to take some extra effort to get it to the point of it being Recurring Nightmare, then it is not a Recurring Nightmare.
Yeah. A lot of cards can be something different if you just surround them with more help.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Matt. What's another pick that you think had a big bombastic opening when we saw it in like preview or spoiler season, but has had more of a modest landing after all?
So I was really, really high on Quilled Greatwurm, which is 4 green for a 7/7 worm from Foundations, has trample, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, you put that many +1/+1 counters onto it, and then you may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying other costs. I thought this was going to be super, super powerful. There's a lot of things working against it, though. First off, so much of the single target removal is exile based, unless you're playing like red effectively. But so many different things have exile based removal. So the second ability, I don't know how often that's ever going to be relevant. And also, too, like I really like the vigor type of effect, dealing combat damage to get bigger. But I've been really, really hoping that this is going to kind of live up to the hype. And every time I've seen people talking about it, it's not at all, which is really disappointing for me because I really love a vigor type of card.
Yeah, this one, honestly, the comparison in my mind is to Necropolis Regent. Which is like a decent card. It's a cool vampire, 6 mana, 6/5 flying. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you get that many +1 counters on it. I like Necropolis Regent a whole lot, and I like the Greatwurm a lot too. But when you're getting up to that type of mana cost, often you can cast spells that will buff your entire board and win you the game rather than accelerating a position that's already pretty good.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if accelerating is the right word for me to use, but like these are cards that do well when you're doing well, as opposed to slamming the button and actually taking someone out once and for all. And that is a difficult tempo. And speaking for myself, the Quilled Greatwurm, like being able to recast itself in the graveyard, I don't see that happening or being particularly enchanting or valuable to me during the course of a game either. So in terms of green mythics that are big and stompy, yeah, this one isn't as high on my list either.
Yeah, Necropolis Regent is a really good example to compare this to, because I love that card. That's a great card. But it's 6 mana and it's 3 black pips. And like when you get to that point in the game where you're casting something like that and it's going to hit and stick and play long enough for you to do a thing, it better be impactful. And there's a whole lot of cards in the game in that 6, 7, 8 mana range for creatures that impact the board in a back-breaking kind of way. Is this one worth a slot in your deck? I don't know if it is, compared to all of the other bomb 6, 7, 8-ish drops you could be running that maybe do a really specific thing that interacts with your deck or your win condition or your commander as well.
I don't want to put counters on the creatures after they hit you. I want to put counters on creatures before they hit you.
Yeah, but even then, stuff like Vigor, where it at least is able to get your blockers buffed up a little bit.
Yeah.
So having the damage being restricted to happening on your turn really, really puts the dampers on what I was hoping Quilled Greatwurm would be doing. And trust me, I love a big splashy green mythic, but this one, it's fallen short for me.
All right, speaking of mythics, I'm going to move to another one here. And this card's actually still presently very expensive because of a lot of 60-card formats and its applications there. But Screaming Nemesis is a very interesting one to observe in terms of like the relationship between how it's working in 60-card decks versus how it's working in Commander. That is the red card from Duskmourn, a 3-mana 3/3 spirit with haste. And whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any other target. And if a player is dealt damage this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. It's currently showing up in about 5,300 decks or so. This one's very, very interesting. Another one that I don't think is necessarily worth the cost, though. And when it first came out and was kind of dominating a lot of the conversations around the mythics from Duskmourn, I don't think we've seen that it necessarily pans out in the same way from the 60-card formats as it would in Commander. It seems like it's kind of cool, kind of okay here, but it's not the blowout that it can be in other places. And I feel like that's worth discussing.
Yeah, there's a lot of situations where, players not being able to gain life for the rest of the game. That just doesn't apply because so many decks don't really care, or maybe it stops them from gaining 5 life from a Swords to Plowshares. But a lot of what I said around Springheart Nantuko, I think is applying to Screaming Nemesis. Granted, Screaming Nemesis is literally everywhere in 60-card formats right now. If you're playing any sort of red deck, you just want Screaming Nemesis because a 3/3 haste that has some upside is pretty powerful in 20 life formats. For Commander, there's so much just dead space where it doesn't do anything. And a 3/3 hasty creature with no evasion, that kind of falls short in a lot of situations in Commander games.
I have an Agnes the Dragon's Lash deck where it's built around running creatures with haste because they make me tokens. And the entire deck is built around that. And I have a Screaming Nemesis in that deck because I cracked one in a pre-release kit. And it's a perfectly fine card in that deck, and that's it.
That pause.
That's kind of the ideal situation for it, is that deck, and it's fine, and it will probably stick around, but it's not also one of those cards I look at and I'm like, well, this is never coming out of this list because it's so amazing. It's fine, and I will keep running it in there until something better comes along, but that might not take that long because it's only decent.
you don't want to spend $25 cash
Absolutely.
on a card that's just fine in Commander. You can get so much more power for your dollar, especially if you're playing like some sort of red deck wins type of strategy, than doing it with Screaming Nemesis. So I just the price, it's absolutely a house in 20 life formats.
Yes.
But in 40 life formats where like it's not really going to be relevant, I just struggle to find a home for Screaming Nemesis. And that's totally fine. Like there's a lot of cards that are like that.
I think one of the best homes for it ends up being some of those decks that have the stuffy doll type of situation going around where like you're dealing a bunch of damage to all the creatures in play. That'll trigger this and the stuffy doll, and then you can send damage at another player. That sounds great. It's just that's also a lot more niche than maybe this card first looked like it would have more broad application.
Yeah.
It's just a good Punisher card in general. And the decks where it's currently seeing the most play are things like the Lord of Pain, which is a black-red Punisher deck. But the thing is, decks like that already plays like Sulfurous Vortex effects that already prevent your opponents from being able to gain life. Or the Lord of Pain himself also actually says your opponents can't gain life in the first place. So that base is kind of already covered. So it can be really cool if you're playing it in a deck that, pairs it up with Blasphemous Act to deal a bunch of damage to your creatures, and then you can send that much damage to other people. But there are a lot of other cards that do that for a lot less money. I think there's even a red sliver that does that for you, and it's a pretty budget sliver. So there's a couple of those options already. So I think its best home winds up being a little bit more niche than it first looked for such a spicy, cool-looking mythic. It's a neat card, but this is a lesson for us to learn about ways that it can react in one format versus another. And here it doesn't necessarily have that same translation, and that's worth pointing out.
The last one here I want to mention is the Lost Jitte from the Big Score bonus set from Thunder Junction. Obviously a callback to Umezawa's Jitte, which is a card that was so broken it was banned out of multiple formats. But it's only okay in Commander. It's a fine card. In an equipment deck, it does pretty good work, but not nearly the powerhouse it is elsewhere. And Lost Jitte is a not as good version of that. So I think it's, when it came in, people saw the name and assumed it was going to be as broken as the previous card was in other formats, not even Commander. And it definitely there was a hype train situation happening with it, and it very much is not worth the hype that came when it was first announced.
1 mana legendary artifact equipment. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage, put a charge counter on Lost Jitte. That's just combat damage in general. Could be combat damage to a creature, to a player, whatever. And you can remove a charge counter from Lost Jitte, and you choose one. You either untap target land, target creature can't block this turn, or you put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature, and it equips for 1. So just 1 mana to play, 1 mana to equip, and a couple of nice abilities there. But it does turn out that a worse Umezawa's Jitte is a worse Umezawa's Jitte.
Right. Well, and the equip cost of 1 is nice, and so is the mana cost. But one thing I've really noticed in the last several years, equipment decks just aren't paying equipment costs anymore, or equip costs anymore. Ideally, there's so many ways to get around that, and they tend to be running as many of them as possible. Sometimes you have to pay it, but the plan is usually to avoid paying that equip cost as much as you can. So that kind of negates this too. You could be running any of these sort of punch and kick effects, and are just going to always be much more consistent than this. And yes, this is cheaper and definitely cheaper to equip, but you're probably not paying the equip cost on those anyway.
Well, and it's so wild too, because it's not like both of these cards are completely unheard of or they've been forgotten. They're showing up in very recent Commanders too. Lost Jitte is showing up in Alexios Demos of Cosmos decks, which was in the Assassin's Creed set, also in Cassandra Eaglebear. I think there's so many better equipments that you could be playing. And this is from somebody who I played a lot of Stoneblade in Legacy, which is all about abusing Umezawa's Jitte. And I just don't see it. The power, again, does not convert from 60 card formats to Commander. It's great. It's still very powerful. But with a format full of X1s walking around versus a format walking around with a bunch of 10/10s, what these cards are doing in other formats, they're not really doing in Commander.
The original Umezawa's Jitte getting 2 counters and also having the ability to give -1/-1 to enemy creatures, that's something that sets it, I think, very, very far apart compared to what Lost Jitte is doing. And Dana, You actually just named a bunch of other types of equipment that I think can fulfill a similar role to this that also achieve some of the same effects. You can play other equipment that buff up the creature way faster than a simple +1 counter occasionally will do. You can play some equipment that give your creature protection from colors and therefore force them to not be able to block. You can play equipment that will help you get more mana in general than just untapping one target land. So even though this thing is cheap, it turns out the mana cost is kind of commensurate to the actual abilities it has. I don't dislike Lost Jitte, but I'm certainly not spending the $8 to go and grab it. And I don't think it is a better card than the original Jitte. But it's another instance where we see, again, here are cards that have certain histories attached to them based off of what they are calling back to. We saw a lot of that this year. And a lot of those cards are, thankfully, not living up to the same broken potential that those other cards did. But that, I think, is a big lesson for us as players, is that when we see those callbacks, very often they have been restrained so much that we shouldn't let ourselves get too hyped up for them, because they're not necessarily going to land based off of our previous expectation, because that tends to be how having big expectations works.
Yeah, well, and both of these specific equipments, they almost function like charms so much. And we love charms on the show. Like you have Golgari Charm, which is one of the most played charms out there. And you love the flexibility behind cards like this. But just Lost Jitte is so underwhelming in how they translate over to Commander that it's not surprising that kind of like, all right, whatever.
I think there's a lot to learn from these for sure. And one of the cool things about when we see new cards is the fact that they do excite us this much. And seeing those callbacks is really fantastic and really wonderful. But it's good for us to zoom out as well and to be, a little bit more grounded in reality and a bit more practical about what these cards are actually doing and where they really landed, because I think that'll make us better at card evaluation in the future. So guys, this has been really, really fun. I'm glad that we could be practical about looking at some of these cards and debate about some of them and whether or not they actually are overrated. Listeners, we definitely have to hear from you. Do you disagree with some of our evaluations here? Are there cards that you think are way more overrated from this year? Let us know in the comments. Hit us up. But with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. So fellas, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where can they find you online? Matt?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform. Try out Blue Sky. It's been a great place to head over, especially lately, at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, this week's episode is brought to you by Cardsphere.com. So if you want some awesome ways to score some deals, convert your old cards into new, flashy, shiny cards, check out Cardsphere.com.
And Dana.
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I have been where skies are blue, just like Matt, more often than that as well lately. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at Joseph M. Schultz, also on the Blue Skies and often on Instagram. And you can find the cast at EDHRECast everywhere online. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.